Job was a man who had it all: wealth, health, and family. But one day, everything was taken from him. In his struggle to understand suffering, he confronted his friends, questioned God, and sought answers that went beyond human understanding. How can anyone continue to believe in God's justice when everything seems lost? This is the story of a man who never stopped fighting, even when his faith was tested in the most cruel way. My name is Job, and this is my story. In the land of Uz lived a man named Job, known for his great wealth and exemplary life. Job was a man of integrity and righteousness, who feared God and shunned evil. He had a large family, 7 sons and 3 daughters, as well as impressive material wealth. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was considered the most important man in the East. Job's children would often host feasts at their homes during their birthdays, inviting their 3 sisters to share the food and drink. After these times of celebration, Job performed a purification ritual for his children. Early in the morning, he offered burnt sacrifices for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This act of devotion was a constant practice in Job's life. God, seeing Job's upright life, praised his virtues before Satan, as described in the first chapter, verses 1 to 5. However, Satan argued that Job's righteousness was only due to the blessings and protection that God had given him. One day, when the angels presented themselves before the Lord, Satan was also among them. The Lord asked him, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth on it." The Lord, highlighting Job's righteousness, said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." To this, Satan replied, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him, his household, and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased throughout the land." These dialogues, narrated in the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 6 to 10, reflect the challenge Satan posed. He insisted that if he were allowed to inflict suffering on Job, he would change and end up cursing God. God allowed Satan to torment Job to test his bold claim that Job would lose his integrity in the face of suffering. However, God set a clear limit. Satan could not take Job's life. In response, Satan said, "But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." God replied, "Very well, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." With this, Satan left the Lord's presence. These events are recounted in the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. What followed was a chain of devastating tragedies for Job. In a single day, he received 4 pieces of news that would change his life forever: the death of his servants, the loss of his sheep and camels, and the death of his 10 children. First, a messenger arrived with the news. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked. They took the animals and killed the servants with the sword. "I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived saying, "God's fire fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants. I am the only one who escaped to tell you." Then a third messenger reported, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties, took the camels, and killed the servants with the sword. I am the only one who escaped to inform you." Finally, a 4th messenger brought the most heartbreaking news. "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house when a mighty wind swept in from the desert. It struck the 4 corners of the house, which collapsed on them, and they died. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. These tragic events, narrated in the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 13 to 19, marked the beginning of the hardest trial in Job's life. In his deep mourning, Job tore his clothes and shaved his head, a common act of grief at the time. However, what was most striking was his spiritual response. Even in the midst of suffering, he praised God. At that moment, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and falling to the ground, worshipped the Lord, saying, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Despite the tragedy, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. This profound response of faith is found in the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 20 to 22. After this, Satan again presented himself before God, and the Lord gave him another opportunity to test Job's faithfulness. This time, Job suffered terrible wounds on his skin, his body covered with painful sores. Job's wife, desperate over his suffering, tried to persuade him to curse God and give up life. However, Job resisted, seeking to endure his suffering with patience. Thus, two storylines intertwine, a celestial one, where Job's faith is tested, and an earthly one, marked by the physical and emotional suffering of this righteous man. The events on earth in the story of Job are the result of something that had already occurred in heaven. Just as in earthly wars, where battles on earth reflect heavenly conflicts, as described in the book of Revelation, in Job's case, what happens in his life is a reflection of a cosmic confrontation between God and Satan. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, Job's three friends, arrived to comfort him. They sat with him in silence for 7 days, respecting his mourning and pain. During this time of silence, Job, broken by his suffering, began to speak and, in a dialogue filled with despair, compared life and death to light and darkness. He cursed the day of his birth, wishing he had never been born, and desired that his birth had been covered in darkness, feeling that life only increased his agony. Eliphaz, the first to respond, pointed out that Job, who had once comforted others, now seemed to not understand the suffering of others. He concluded that Job's pain must be the result of some hidden sin, and advised him to seek God's favor for forgiveness and relief. Bildad and Zophar agreed that Job must have committed some wrong to provoke God's justice, suggesting that he should demonstrate more innocent and upright behavior to receive God's forgiveness. Bildad, more cruelly, concluded that Job's children had brought death upon themselves through their own sin. Zophar, for his part, implied that any mistake Job had made deserved not only this suffering, but much more pain than he was already experiencing. Thus, while Job suffered, his friends, though well-intentioned, did not understand the depth of his anguish nor the purpose behind his trial. Job, deeply irritated by the accusations and advice of his friends, responded harshly, calling them worthless doctors, and accusing them of masking their lack of help with lies. In the book of Job, chapter 13, verses 1 to 4, Job expresses his frustration. "My ears have heard and understood what you know. I also know I am not inferior to you, but I desire to speak with the Almighty and argue my case with God. Yet you defame me with lies. You are all worthless doctors." Job questions divine judgment, wondering why God evaluates people based on their actions when, in his power, he could easily correct or forgive those acts. Job is perplexed as to how a human being can fully satisfy the justice of a God whose wisdom and ways are mysterious and beyond human understanding. Additionally, Job reflects on humanity's impotence to persuade God with words, recognizing that God cannot be deceived or influenced by human discourse. In his anguish, Job admits that he does not even have enough knowledge to defend his case before God, making it clear the gap between his suffering and God's incomprehensible justice. In the midst of his suffering, Job longs for someone who can mediate between him and God, someone who can help him avoid being condemned to Sheol, the underworld. Job believes that in heaven there is a witness or redeemer who attests to his integrity, as expressed in Job 19:25. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. In Job 16:19, Job says, even now my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high. As his suffering becomes increasingly unbearable, Job grows bitter, anxious, and fearful. He laments the apparent injustice of God allowing the wicked to prosper, while he and many other righteous people suffer. Job longs to confront God, protest, and express his pain, but he cannot physically find him. Though he believes that God's wisdom is hidden from humanity, he decides to pursue it by fearing God and avoiding evil. Eventually, in the midst of this dilemma, God intervenes in the dialogue, breaking the divine silence that had marked the first round of discussions. Throughout his speeches, Job had asked God to speak to him 36 times, and finally, his wish is granted twice. God appears to Job in the midst of a storm, and while the tone of his message is serious, there is a certain humor in the way he addresses him. God reminds Job that he is the creator of everything. He reviews his amazing activity of creating and sustaining the universe, asking Job if he could match that work. In the end, God challenges Job's attitude, questioning whether he is in a position to judge. He points out that it is presumptuous for Job to think that God should explain himself to him. Through this encounter, Job is confronted with the enormity of God's power and wisdom, which puts his suffering and complaints into perspective. Job feels utterly small and insignificant when faced with the magnitude of God's responses. In the end, he responds with humility. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. This reaction reflects Job's recognition of his inability to comprehend God's infinite wisdom. In the second encounter, God does not speak about himself as creator, but instead focuses on two of his creatures, the hippopotamus, the behemoth, and the crocodile, the leviathan. With a touch of humor, God asks Job for his thoughts about these huge beasts, as if these creatures might have answers to the great mysteries of life. Through this, Job is reminded that if he cannot understand God or the animal world, he certainly cannot comprehend the mysteries of the moral world. God's message is clear. Why try to argue with me, Job? In his response, Job acknowledges God's omniscience and understands that no divine plan can be thwarted. He realizes that his questioning of God was completely inappropriate, and overwhelmed by the understanding of his error, he despises himself. In an act of genuine repentance, Job sits in ashes and dust, symbolizing his humility and recognition of God's greatness. Although the encounter with God is deeply humbling for Job, it addresses the core of his problem, which is ultimately resolved. At this moment, Job reconnects with God, and the dialogue reaches a sublime and unexpected climax. In the epilogue, the text shifts from poetry to prose, marking a significant change in the narrative. By accepting that he should not blame God for his sufferings, Job experiences complete restoration. In his mercy, God returns everything Job had lost: his children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, his possessions, camels and flocks of sheep, making Job far wealthier and happier than before. This act of restoration symbolizes Job's rehabilitation as a servant of God. However, Job's 3 friends receive a severe rebuke from God. He tells them that they did not speak rightly about Job, indicating that we should not take their speeches as absolute truths. This message emphasizes that, although they tried to justify Job's suffering, they lacked the full perspective and understanding of the divine plan. What is most notable in the 2 rounds of dialogue between God and Job is that God never directly answers Job's questions, nor reveals the nature of his bet with Satan. Job never learns what happened in heaven because, as God implicitly says, Job did not need to know that information. Job's suffering was part of a greater divine plan, and though he did not understand it, God had his reasons for allowing him to suffer. Finally, it is important to highlight the difference in understanding of this book between the Jewish and Christian perspectives. In the Jewish tradition, Job is primarily seen as an example of justice and piety in the face of human suffering, while in the Christian tradition, he can also be interpreted as a figure who prefigures the suffering of Christ and redemption. These 2 interpretations enrich the text and its message over the centuries. The Old Testament Jew could not fully comprehend the problems of temporal life in light of eternity. He believed that the justice of God should be seen in this life, as both the righteous and the unrighteous shared the same fate, Sheol, a shadowy place of existence where spirits slept. This view reflects a limited understanding of life after death, without a clear vision of what might lie beyond physical death. On the other hand, Christians have a completely different perspective on suffering in the present life, interpreting it in light of Christ's redemptive work. From this view, present suffering becomes insignificant in comparison to the eternal life that is expected in heaven. In this way, Christians see the suffering of Job and other Old Testament figures through the lens of Christian hope in life after death, firmly anchored in the resurrection of Christ. In the book of Job, hints about life after death are few. Job expresses at one point that after his death he will find God, but this theme is not recurrent and is not developed in detail. The main focus is on present suffering and Job's relationship with God while alive, without a clear understanding of what will happen after death. The book of Job has 2 main plots, the divine plot and the earthly plot. The divine plot begins in heaven, where God meets with Satan. Satan, who was originally an angel with the task of reporting human sins, becomes the cynical accuser who does not believe that anyone can love God for who he is, but only for what he can provide them. Satan tests this belief in Job, arguing that Job is only faithful to God because he has been blessed with wealth and prosperity. This is the starting point of the debate between God and Satan, which will later be reflected in the earthly events that Job will experience. This heavenly conflict sets the stage for Job's suffering and his struggle to understand the justice of God, which is the central theme of the earthly plot. As Job faces his trials on earth, the dialogue between the divine and earthly plots highlights the interaction between what happens in heaven and its repercussions in Job's life, focusing on human suffering, divine justice, and fidelity to God. The divine wager between God and Satan establishes the central conflict of Job. Satan argues that Job is only faithful because he has been blessed, and that if those blessings were taken away, Job would curse God. God, however, defends Job's loyalty, and the challenge begins when Job is subjected to a series of painful tests. However, Job is unaware of this wager, which makes his suffering all the more tragic and genuine to him. The tension in this scenario is key to the drama of the book, as the reader is aware of the reason behind Job's suffering, while he himself is not. Regarding Satan, this encounter teaches us something important. He is not omnipresent like God. Although he travels through the earth, he cannot be in 2 places at once. This limitation is crucial because it highlights the difference between God's divine nature and Satan's created nature. The wager also underscores the idea that Satan is an active agent in the world, but always within the limits set by God. On the human level, the debate between Job and his friends forms the bulk of the book. Job's friends are convinced that his suffering is the consequence of some hidden sin, while Job defends himself, convinced of his innocence. This exchange creates significant tension, as the reader knows that Job is not suffering due to sin, while the friends insist otherwise. This discrepancy highlights one of the book's deepest lessons. No one has complete knowledge of the reasons behind human suffering. The most fundamental point explored in the book is the issue of human suffering and faith in God. Job, like many of us in times of suffering, faces the painful question of whether he can continue to believe in a good and just God when everything seems to be against him. This question resonates with anyone who has experienced deep and painful trials. The answer is not easy, and the book shows us that faith in God is not always linked to prosperity or the absence of suffering. However, it also raises the idea that our understanding of human suffering is limited, and that God's plan transcends our ability to fully comprehend it. Job's greatest pain was not only physical suffering or social humiliation, but his spiritual anguish. Though covered in sores and in unbearable physical pain, what truly broke him was the sense of being completely distant from God. Job found himself in such deep despair that he wished God would find him and speak to him. The uncertainty of why he was suffering, combined with his belief that he had done nothing to deserve it, led to a spiritual anguish even greater than his physical pain. Suffering becomes much more unbearable when we believe that God is distant or indifferent. Job, in facing this situation, not only dealt with social rejection and illness, but also with spiritual emptiness, leading him to cry out intensely to God for an answer. This spiritual anguish reflects one of the most heartbreaking depths of human suffering, the feeling of being disconnected from God, without understanding or comfort. When Job finally had the opportunity to speak with God, the divine response was not what he had expected. Instead of offering him a direct explanation of his suffering, God confronted him with his infinite wisdom and power, reminding him that he does not have complete knowledge of the world, and that divine justice and ways are much more complex than he can comprehend. This encounter changed Job's perspective, though it did not answer all his questions. However, God's presence in his life was the beginning of his restoration, showing that sometimes true healing comes not from understanding why we suffer, but from reconnecting with God's presence and acknowledging his sovereignty. For Christians, the book of Job takes on a new dimension when viewed through the lens of the New Testament, particularly through the life, suffering, and resurrection of Jesus. Job, who experiences deep suffering without understanding the purpose behind it, in some way anticipates what Christ experienced on the cross, when Jesus, under both physical and spiritual torment, also cries out to God asking why. This establishes a meaningful connection between human suffering and divine suffering, showing that even the Son of God experienced a disconnection from the purpose of his suffering under the intensity of the cross. From the Christian perspective, Job's suffering is contextualized within a broader vision, the hope of life after death. Christians believe that although we do not always understand the purpose of our suffering in this life, there is a promise of resurrection and eternal life with God. This belief is tied to the resurrection of Jesus and the ultimate victory over sin and death. In the Greek version of the book of Job, a reference to Job's hope of resurrection is added, who, like all the righteous, will be resurrected. Finally, the hope of resurrection and final justice becomes even more relevant in the Christian context. Christians believe that at the end of times, Jesus will return as judge, and all human beings will be judged according to their deeds. This final judgment will bring vindication to the righteous, like Job, and the perfect application of divine justice. In this sense, what Job longed for, a just resolution of his suffering and the restoration of his life, will be fulfilled in the second coming of Christ, when God's justice will become a reality for all of humanity. The story of Job teaches us that suffering is an inexplicable and painful part of human life, but it also reminds us that faith, even in the midst of despair, can lead us to restoration. Job never had all the answers, but his journey challenges us to question, to struggle with our doubts, and to keep our hope in something greater than ourselves. In the end, his story is not just about pain, but about the possibility of redemption and the justice of God, which will manifest in due time. Sometimes true victory lies in continuing to believe, even when we don't understand why.